presentation is going to be with Matthew Ikanyama. He enlisted in the Navy in February of 2009 as a diesel mechanic and was sent overseas to the USS Essex and then later the USS Bonhomme Richard, as he points out, before it burned, where he was stationed in Sasebo, Japan. Matt participated in multiple joint service multinational exercises through 4 consecutive deployments. And in February 2015, he transitioned from active duty to the Naval Reserves. And by December 2018, Matt graduated from Brigham Young University, Idaho, with a BS in psychology. In October 2021, Matt was commissioned as an ensign in the Navy Chaplains Candidate Program. He then graduated from BYU Provo with a Master of Arts in Chaplaincy in April of 2022. Congratulations on that, by the way. As a developing subject matter expert on the moral injury literature and socioculture research impacts, Matt continues his preparation for the chaplaincy and has already helped numerous service members in the U.S. Armed Forces in ministering ways that respects the individual's spirituality and existentiality, independent of religion or faith traditions. So, Matt, you're on.
First and foremost, while getting this set up, I'd like to thank Greg, the UD War Foundation, for putting this on and letting us come here to speak with you all today. For my piece, it's going to primarily focus on moral injury. I did an extensive literature review, so I looked at research of moral injury from 2009 to 2020 in October, and then since then I've continued that exploratory research and the research of moral injury. Pardon my thought process, just a second while I get set up. So this is essentially moral injury in the military and insights for the EOD community. What I took away from this research and how it can apply to EOD text. So first off, I want to throw a few numbers at you. The first one being during the global war on terrorism from 2001 to 2021, the ratio between military suicides and combat fatalities was approximately a 4.276 to 1 ratio. So that means is for every combat fatality we suffered overseas, 4.276 service members took their lives here at home. That is unacceptable. Unacceptable. Last year, the VA mental health services annual budget was $10.2 billion. That same year, their suicide prevention annual budget was $313 million. So clearly, these resources have been allocated, but what we're doing just isn't working. It's not cutting it. So why am I here? As Greg said, after I joined the Navy in 2009, throughout the course of my career, I began to see something that I couldn't quite identify. I knew that there was something around myself, the sailors, the Marines that I was with, that something just wasn't right. And throughout the course of my career, through the active duty component and the reserves, 3 of my friends committed suicide. One was in the Army, one was in the Air Force, and one was in the Marine Corps. Knowing what I know now about moral injury, there is no doubt in my mind all 3 of them, to some extent, suffer from moral injury. I know that I'm throwing that term moral injury out a lot, and I promise we'll get to it. You just have to bear with me for a moment. If you've read Sun Tzu's Art of War, you might be familiar with this quote. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. The bottom line is, moral injury is an invisible enemy we simply do not know. So how to define it? How do we put words to this phenomenon? Essentially, from the research, moral injury results from an individual being exposed to events that involves their perception, the individual perception of either personally perpetrating, i.e. commission, witnessing, i.e. omission, or being ordered by a leader, i.e. direction, to violate their moral values. And again, I cannot hit on this enough. It is individual perception here that is the key. It's not something for me to say to the individual, oh, this is what you should do, and this is what you should believe, and this is how you should feel about it. It's up to them to say for themselves, no, this is my experience. I know myself better than you do. It's for me to say how I should feel about these experiences. So to kind of pull apart the differences between moral injury and PTSD, I've generated this chart to help visually explain from a theoretical standpoint how we can pull these apart. For example, moral injury in the research has been seen as a traumatic violation of personal values, like I said earlier, whereas we know PTSD is that traumatic threat to personal well-being. Furthermore, moral injury is based on morals and ethics, whereas PTSD is that fear and adrenaline fight-or-flight response. Researchers have characterized moral injury as a spiritual soul wound, whereas we know that PTSD is that physical, psychological. And then finally, again, moral injury is something that you perceive, whereas PTSD is something that happens to you. Additionally, there's been research conducted to examine the differences neurologically between PTSD and moral injury in the human brain. So if you look at this top picture here, you can see that for an individual suffering from PTSD, a lot of the regions that are activated are in the inner parts of the brain, the reptilian brain, that fight or flight response. But if we look here at a picture of somebody who is suffering from moral injury, a lot of the areas are higher functioning in the cortex of the brain. That results from higher cognitive functioning, which is indicative of the perceptual piece of moral injury. So to kind of give examples of what this might look like for an EOD tech, how they might have encountered this during the course of their career, I pulled examples of commission, omission, and direction. So an example of commission for an EOD tech might be an EOD tech trains team leaders, but later finds out that one of the team leaders dies in an IED explosion. Their thought process might be, maybe if I would have trained them better, they wouldn't have been killed. An example of omission might be an EOD tech sweeps an alley for IEDs, but misses an EFP hidden in a wall that later hits a coalition convoy. From what I understand, EFPs didn't come out of the initial push into Iraq, and they came later. So that wasn't something that they knew was a threat until it was a threat. And then for direction, a security element for an EOD team is pulled off mission for a perceived lower priority mission. The security element is supposed to have your back, but this captain over here is saying they got to go somewhere else, but what about me? I'm supposed to be making this area safe. So the first lesson learned that we pulled away from the scientific research is that moral injury is a profoundly human phenomenon that cuts across time and culture and has specific and immediate effect. So what I mean by that is, a lot of the examples we pulled from were from GWAT veterans. But we wondered, is this a phenomenon that exists just in GWAT, or does it expand past our modern day? So we looked at examples from Vietnam, Korea, World War I, World War II. The earliest account from U.S. history that I found was from the U.S. Civil War. And in this account, a Union officer was leading his brigade on an attack against a Confederate position on a hill. And off in the distance, he could see this other Confederate officer readying a counterattack to hit his man in the flank. And he knew if that counterattack rolled through, he was going to lose a lot of his guys. So he turned to his sharpshooter and says, I want you to shoot that Confederate officer. The sharpshooter raised up his rifle, fired, the Confederate officer dropped off his horse, and the Confederates kind of dispersed back. So as this assault was proceeding, the Union officer turned to his sharpshooter and said, hey, let's go check on that Confederate officer because he was a brave man. So the Union sharpshooter got to the spot where the officer had fallen, and he found him face down. So rolled him back over it to his face up. And then the officer, that Confederate officer, uttered one word before he died, and that was father. Because that Confederate officer was the Union sharpshooter's son, who had gone south before the war. And this sharpshooter was understandably so distraught about what he had just done. He ripped off his coat and he charged single-handedly against the Confederate lines. And he was shot and wounded and fell, and he could have stayed down and crawled to safety, but instead he jumped right back up and he kept charging by himself, where he was, again, subsequently shot and killed. What that experience demonstrates to us is that moral injury doesn't have a 6-month wait time. It can have, and sometimes does have, immediate negative effects on the individual. Our second lesson learned from this research was that warriors are not just human, but meaning makers. And they don't just stop meaning making once they put on their uniforms. So it's our job to discover what helps each individual warrior to both make sense of and meaning from the chaos of war. This points to the importance of meaning making in the healing process. So that term meaning making pops up a lot on this quote. So what is that? What does meaning making mean? Essentially, it is what the individual who sees this traumatic event, what meaning they attach to it. What if, for example, if an EOD tech watches one of their buddies die, an understandably traumatic experience, what type of meaning are they going to place on their buddy's death? What type of meaning are they going to place on their own life moving forward after that event? So 5 key takeaways from the research that we have found. I hope we'll hit on this enough, is that moral injury is not the same thing as PTSD. It's not. The second point is that increased self-empathy and self-forgiveness leads to less severe moral injury in these individuals. Third point is, oh, I'm so sorry, I missed the last one. Third point is that positive meaning making, the ability to make more positive associations within the individual for those experiences, is associated with less severe moral injury symptoms. Fourth point is that healing from moral injury is an interdisciplinary collaboration due to the ethics and morals being existential principles. Early on in the research, a lot of these different disciplines tried to claim moral injury as their own. Doctors said, hey, this is our field. And then the psych said, no, this is ours. And then you got chaplains saying, no, 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 this should be our field. What they realized pretty quickly is that they couldn't handle it on their own. That they needed the help from each other to actually tackle this issue within the people that they were seeing it manifest itself in. They needed the docs, they needed the psychs, and they needed the chaplains together to tackle this issue. And then the final point that I think is most pertinent is that peer support is being explored as a viable healing process. In the same way that the psychs aren't going to be in every single unit, the chaplain's not going to be able to see every single EOD tech, those two techs that have been working together months and months overseas, they know the experiences that they faced. They know the challenges that they've had. They know each other better than anyone else, I would say. Once they are able to have that dialogue and start talking to each other about these challenges, these experiences that they've had, that can be very therapeutic, that can be very helpful in helping them to start coming out of that in a more positive way. Through the course of this research, I was not an EOD tech. I had no experience in the EOD community when I was active duty in the reserves. I had no idea what I was getting into. I turned to a friend of mine, Nathan Peterson, who was an Army EOD for 16 years, and said, hey, I need some help understanding what it was like for you being an EOD tech. So we sat down for 3 hours, and he pulled out these insights that he's allowing me to share with you today. First insight that he shared with me is that EOD techs are highly intelligent problem solvers. He said, essentially, if you stick an EOD tech in a doctor's waiting room for longer than 15 minutes, they're going to start taking out their Leatherman and pulling stuff apart, because that's just who they are. The second point he said is that when he was out in combat, you get this huge adrenaline dump into your system. And once you leave that environment and you transition back to the civilian world, there's nothing quite like it again. And he said some EOD techs that he knew chased that adrenaline rush to try to get back to that adrenaline high. And the third was a powerful personal insight for him as we had continued this conversation. First point being, if I can figure out anything, that's the kind of person that he said EOD techs are. They can figure out anything. If I can figure out anything, so why can't I figure this out? Why can't I figure out why my family life isn't the way it should be? Why can't I figure out why my marriage isn't how it should be? The second point is, if nothing I'm doing is working, then I must be the one who's broken. If all these common denominators that are going wrong in my life, that must be me. Then his third point that he had to try to help me understand is, in the field, after doing everything you can, you blow things in place. If you can't move the ordnance or the munitions, you have to blow it in place, from what he had told me. And so this last point was, maybe the safest thing I can do for those around me is blow it in place. And from this line of thinking that he had drawn out of his mind with this conversation that I had, he said, maybe this can help to understand why there's such a high suicide rate within the EOD community. So ways forward. We talked about kind of the bad, that moral injury can have negative outcomes, and often it does. But with proper guidance, it can also have positive outcomes. Now I'd like to turn the time over to Greg to introduce Dr. Ingerson, who will talk more about the positive outcomes associated.
Can we check in? I just want to check in with the Zoom people, make sure
Yeah.
that they hear everything okay, everything's going okay.
How we sound on Zoom? You guys picking up everything? Thumbs up. It's good.